Actually be live now. Yes, we're live. All right, guys. Sorry for the delay. This Streamlabs is not wanting to be my friend. And this, hopefully you guys see this because can pop over here because I had to just do like a new stream altogether because the scheduled stream it wasn't letting me open that up. But all that to say, you guys, I'm excited for this conversation because we are going to listen to historian Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, but a historian, a British historian, who has a book called Dominion, which I'll grab it right here. I actually have it right here. Currently working my way through it. Dominion, great book, highly recommend. And in this book, and in just some of his scholarship in general, he explores how unwittingly Christianized the world is today, the modern world. And so the topic that we're going to be discussing here is the title is the post-Christian world would hate the pre-Christian one. And we're just going to explore and listen to Tom Holland explore what was the world like before Christianity kind of sanitized it. Now there are people throughout history who have claimed Christianity who have done horrific things. No one's denying that. But the essential tenets, the ethics that Christianity largely introduced to the world cannot be denied. So we'll dive into that. We'll start that in just a moment. But first, hey, I'm Christopher. I'm the Nerdy Christian. On this channel, we talk media and just entertainment and nerdy media in particular. We talk Christianity, theology, and the Bible and stuff, and intellectualism, world affairs, and philosophy, and those kinds of things, all right? So we have fun with those things and the intersections of all three. My goal is to help people to think critically, to use discernment, and to be generally wise people. So welcome to the page. If this is your first time, feel free to hit that subscribe button if this is interesting to you. And with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Let's pull this video up and explore what Tom Holland has to say about the effect of Christianity on the West first and then the world.
But I found the project of spending 2-3 years trying to inhabit the heads of the Romans and the Greeks an increasingly unsettling and, in fact, disturbing experience. So, writing about...
So just some quick context on what he's talking about. He started out kind of just studying Persian history, Greek history, Roman history and stuff, ancient history in general. And he's setting the context for his studies in which he began to kind of try to inhabit their minds to understand their worldviews and stuff. And his experience in that and how as an agnostic himself. So what I really think is interesting about Tom Holland is he started out atheist. Now I think he would identify as agnostic. But as an agnostic himself, he kind of began to wonder, these people, or began to recognize these people have an entirely different, fundamentally different understanding of ethics and morality than I do today. And he actually begins to realize where his morality is rooted is Christianity, despite him not attributing himself to Christian beliefs. So we'll go ahead and continue with that.
Julius Caesar, for instance. One of the figures who had obsessed me as a child. When I wrote about Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, what's now France, it was a horrendous narrative. It was a narrative of genocide and enslavement. Caesar, it is said, slaughtered 1 million Gauls in the course of his conquest. He enslaved another 1 million. And to the Romans, these were not crimes. In fact, these were achievements to be celebrated. When Caesar staged his triumph, his great procession of victory through the streets of Rome, prisoners followed his chariot, placards were carried, boasting.
Real quick interjection, because I know the thing that a lot of people, if you're being critical, you might think, well, what about like the Spanish and the like slave trade and all of these things in modern society? People didn't care about that, and actually, what's oftentimes ignored is the everyday population was oftentimes outraged by the things that they heard of how people were being treated in other places. So like the trade of slaves from the Indies, for instance, didn't last super long in Spain, largely because of public response. Now that specific thing is something I know like surface level about, but I know that people kind of abhorred some of the stories they heard of the Spanish conquistadors and such in the New World. Actually, Cortez was kind of on the run when he took out Tenochtitlan, and I know I'm butchering the pronunciation of that, but when he took that out and overthrew the Aztecs, that wasn't like with the blessing even of the crown, really. He started his whole expedition without authorization, as kind of his own foray, his own attempt to escape some consequences for him that were coming down the barrel. So just something to think about is like the tenets and kind of the public perception as a whole is what we're talking about. We're not saying that tragedies have not been committed throughout history, because I mean, look at the Holocaust, right? Like, obviously tragedies continue, but also look at the world's outrage at what happened with the Holocaust, because the world has been largely Christianized, not in that everyone has become Christian, but in that everyone has been exposed to Christian standards of morality through Christianity permeating first the West and then much of the rest of the world, whether people adhere to it or not in their own individual lives and expressions of power. So let's continue.
Of the feats of slaughter and annihilation that Caesar had accomplished. And I found this, as I say, unsettling. And when I came to write about the Battle of Thermopylae, perhaps the most heroic doomed stand in the whole of history, the 300 Spartans dying for the sake of Sparta and for liberty, a story that had always, again, thrilled me from my childhood, and tried to get inside the heads of the Spartans. Again, I found it a deeply, deeply disturbing place to be. The Spartans had provided the Nazis with their blueprint for the occupation of much of Eastern Europe. The Spartans had enslaved a fellow Greek city, turned their fellow Greeks into slaves, and depended on these slaves for the maintenance of their warrior society. Notoriously, when children were born, they would have to be brought to a council of elders who would inspect the children, and if it was felt that these babies would not measure up, either as warriors or as the breeders of warriors, then they would be flung down a ravine. And again, as I say, I found this disturbing. And I began to ask myself, well, why do I find it disturbing? Because in a way, the most unsettling thing about both, say, Rome or Sparta was the fact that nobody in these societies seemed to find their morals and their values unsettling at all. If they were cruel, then it was, if they were callous, then it was, in a way, kind of innocently callous. And so I thought, well, what has changed? But it wasn't only in morals and ethics that I became aware of an immense chasm between antiquity and our own age. It was also in the very fundamentals of the language that I was using. And of course, English, not quite as much as Romanian, but to a degree, is one very stamped by Latin. And so when I came to use the word to think about something, say religion, did the Romans have a religion? It didn't feel right. Did the Greeks have a religion? Again, it didn't quite feel right. It felt the wrong word to apply to what the Greeks and the Romans were doing. And this is despite the fact that you will read, many books in which say about, you'll get a chapter on Greek religion, Roman religion, Egyptian religion. And then everything else is kind of treated as though it's nothing to do with religion. But this didn't seem to correspond at all to the Greek or Roman world, in which actually there didn't seem to be any division at all between the dimension of what we today call religion and the rest of life. It all seemed to be a totality. And so I started asking myself, well, where does our modern word religion, where has it come from, and how does it differ, say, from what the Romans thought of religion? And it comes, so I started reading up. Religion, you have the same derivation in Romanian, comes from the Latin word religio. But religio did not mean what religion means to us. A religio was a bond. It joined the Roman people to the gods.
I want to just touch on this too, that yes, the fundamental experience of religion pre-Christianity is very different to what we would describe today. It's almost more about ritual. So the Romans actually got really offended at Christians because they wouldn't participate in the rituals that unified Rome, right? And they blamed Christians then for if something went wrong, they'd say it's because you didn't participate in the rituals, in the honoring of our gods. But it was more about appeasement of these beings than about a practice of life that extends throughout the entirety of your life. So yeah, that's a note to touch on.
But a religio was a display of punctilious worship. It could have been a sacrifice, it could have been a festival, it could have been the institution of a priesthood. But it did not mean religion in the sense that we have the word today. And so I wondered, well, what changed? And what changed was that Christianity came along. And for the Romans, there were many religiones because there were many gods. There were many ways of joining the Roman people to the worship of the gods. But for the Christians, there was only one religio. And in the 5th century, the early 5th century, Rome was sacked. And the shock of this was felt across the Roman world. And people who worshipped the old gods, people who felt that the old religiones should be maintained, they said, this is the fault of the Christians. We have abandoned the religiones of the gods, and so they have turned their backs on us.
That's what I said. That's exactly what I said about how they responded. Anyways, continuing.
But the great father of the Latin Church, St. Augustine, his response was, this is not true. And the word that he fixed on was one that immediately kind of made my ears prick up, because he said, actually, Rome, the Roman Empire, like all human life, belongs to the dimension of the saeculum. And the saeculum in Latin means the span of human life. And more broadly, it means the way in which things that are born, live, are doomed to die. Essentially, so essentially, the saeculum for Augustine means the flux of the fallen world, the way in which nothing is forever. And he counterpoints this to the dimension of heaven, where all is radiant and eternal. And the only way that fallen humanity can attain this radiant eternity, Augustine said, is thanks to the religio, the bond that is provided by the church. And so in the Latin-speaking world, the Roman world, the half of the Roman Empire that speaks Latin, Augustine, the great and influential theologian, set up this counterpoint between the saeculum and religio. And over the course of the Middle Ages, this comes to be fundamental to the way that Christians in the Latin-speaking world, as opposed to the Greek-speaking world, comes to understand how society should be ordered. And with the coming of the Reformation and into the modern world, this sense that there are twin dimensions, that there is something called, deriving from saeculum, the secular, and something called religion, and that these two dimensions are separate, which is essentially fundamental to the way that people in the modern West comprehend the world. This came to be taken for granted. But it was not something that would have made any sense at all to the Romans. And so I began to ask myself, if our morals are so different, if our values are so different, and if the very way we understand society is so different, what was the full impact of Christianity? Just how profound was this process of change? And the more I thought about it, the more it came to seem to me that this was actually the profoundest revolution, not just in a European understanding of the world, but because the Latin forms of Christianity, the Catholic and the Protestant forms, have spread across the world. It's a global religion, a global revolution as well. And so
I want to point out on that note of like the global applications of Christianity is, you know, of course, in the sense of like Christianity has since become global there, you know, with huge amounts of believers in South America, Africa, China, South Korea is one particularly notable example, right? That's true. But also Christian morality has been extended to even the world that is outside of Christendom, in which there are very, you know, minuscule amounts of believers. So for instance, slavery was not outlawed in some of the Arab states until like I think the 1950s, maybe even I think some of the Gulf states was 1960s. So a lot of these moral expectations that first appeared in Christian countries, or largely Christian countries, such as Great Britain, you know, getting the ball rolling in the first place on the abolition of slavery in the world. A lot of those extended to these other countries, whether those countries followed Christendom or not, just due to the social dominance of the West and kind of Western standards of morality that were tied to the West's Christian roots, the West's permeation by Christianity. So, continue.
So I set myself the task of writing a book which I came to call Dominion, to see just how total was this process of revolution, just how totally transformed by Christianity was the West, and the further corollary of that, in a world that sees itself in the West as being increasingly post-Christian, as being secular, how Christian does it remain? And the conclusion...
He does talk a little slow, so here's what we're going to do. We're just going to up the playback speed a little bit so we don't have this video being too long for you guys, for those of you especially who are watching later afterwards. So here we are.
The conclusion that I came to was that essentially all of us in the West...
Yeah, that's almost like a normal speaking speed. There we go.
...are like goldfish swimming in Christian waters. We don't recognize...
Okay, we had some interruptions, but I want you to catch that line that he uses a lot, that all of us, he says, all of us in the West are like goldfish swimming in Christian waters, because you're surrounded by it so thoroughly, you don't even realize how Christianized or how sanitized by Christianity so much of society has become today. So that's a key quote. Want to make sure you take away from this video.
That we're swimming in Christian waters because we're in our bowl. But if you can get outside that bowl, then you see just how Christian those waters are. And so I set myself to writing a book that would trace the evolution of this Christian revolution from the pre-Christian world right the way up to the present day. And I'd written 2 or 3 chapters of it when I got a commission from a British TV company to go to Iraq to make a film about what it was that motivated the Islamic State, ISIS, this radically, brutally militant Islamist organization, and specifically to focus on why it was that they were targeting Christians and a particular religious minority called Yazidis for persecution. And so I went to Iraq, and we got permission from the Kurdish government in the north of the country to visit a city called Sinjar. And Sinjar had been, there had been Christians settled there, there'd been Shia Muslims there, Sunni Muslims, and a lot of Yazidis. There aren't many Yazidis in the world. There are about, I should think, about 300,000. But a sizable proportion of them were in this particular town called Sinjar. And in 2014, when the Islamic State moved from Syria into northern Iraq, captured Mosul, they also captured Sinjar. And while they were in Sinjar, they crucified many of the men, and they enslaved many of the women, and not just women. They enslaved girls who were as young as 8. And in 2016, Sinjar got recaptured by the Kurds, and we were allowed to go there a few weeks after the city had been recaptured. But it was still in an absolutely appalling state, and the Islamic State themselves were still a couple of miles, kind of flat no man's land between the Kurdish positions and their own positions. So we went there, and it was a scene of utter and literal desecration. So that's me looking miserable. I'm not a naturally brave person. If I'd known that I was going to end up in this terrible place being shelled by the Islamic State, I would never have gone. But this is the church in Sinjar, and you can see that the altar has been systematically smashed to pieces. And that is the font, and again, you can see that it's been desecrated. Everything's smashed to pieces. All the icons smashed onto the floor. That's a bomb in the front, right in the front. And there was a definite sense that what had particularly aggravated the fighters who came there and who desecrated the church was the cross. So again, to go back to that, that's why there was a very beautiful crucifix there. It had been demolished, and so that's why the people who came back have put the cross back up. So I found that unsettling, but most unsettling of all was the fate visited on the Yazidis, which was evident everywhere. So the Arabic writing is Yazidi, written up by presumably a Sunni Muslim in Sinjar, informing on his neighbors. It has been firebombed, the whole house has been destroyed. And to stand there amid the rubble and to think, people here were crucified. And we then got led out by a Kurdish captain out into the no man's land, where there was a huge barn where the Yazidi women had been taken, and those who were deemed to be attractive enough were taken off into slavery. Those who weren't were taken out and shot, and their bones were still lying in the dirt. And it was a
And just want to emphasize, and he's probably about to get to that here too, like this offends our modern sensibilities very much, but this is the norm of history. Just read about the Mongolian conquests, read about the Turkish conquests, well, some of them, depends on which period. Read about other state conquests, like any empire doing conquest throughout history, like that's kind of the norm of their treatment of people, which is why the general like Christian ethos, and I'm not talking about states who claim Christianity for out of convenience, but like what's actually in the Bible and what's actually taught by it, and what has been generally for most of history, what has been endorsed by the church, is not in favor of this kind of stuff.
A terrifying and horrifying experience. But what I found most terrifying and most horrifying was the sense that I was in an environment, in a town that had been destroyed by people for whom the cross did not have the significance that it had for me and for the society in which I had grown up. That for the Islamic State, the cross served as a symbol of their right to inflict violence on people who resisted them. And this is what the cross had symbolized for the Romans. It had symbolized for them their right to torture to death anyone who presumed to defy their power. And the horror of this seemed to open up a great abyss before me. And I came back from filming in Sinjar, came back from Iraq, returned to my book, and I rewrote the opening to focus on the crucifixion. Because that experience had sharpened for me the utter strangeness of what perhaps can seem too familiar to people who have grown up in a Christian society. The weirdness of the fact that the symbol of Christianity, that the great marker of its identity, should be an instrument of torture. Now, we know that this seemed very, very strange to the earliest Christians as well. And we know that because in the earliest Christian texts we have, the letters written by Paul, it haunts him. He's obsessed by the strangeness of the fact that the Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah, who in some strange way that Paul can't quite pin down, is a part of the one God, the omnipotent, all-creating, all-powerful God. That he did not come as a conqueror, he did not come as a ruler of the world, but he came as someone who suffered the most monstrous death that the Roman Empire could inflict on its subjects. And it was a death that was inflicted not just on rebels against Roman power, although of course it was. I guess the second most famous victims of crucifixion are the followers of Spartacus. Those of you who've seen the Kirk Douglas film will remember the way that the general who defeats Spartacus and his armies puts crosses up along the entire Appian Way, the great road leading south from Rome. And these crosses serve as billboards, advertising both the general's power, but also a warning to any rebels who think about opposing Roman power. This will be your fate. And of course, the slaves, the followers of Spartacus, are slaves. And that's why this punishment was particularly appropriate for them. Because to the Romans, crucifixion was such a monstrous and horrifying punishment that it was seen as being the paradigmatic fate to be visited not just on rebels against Roman power, but specifically on slaves. And the reason that crucifixion was seen as the appropriate punishment to be inflicted on rebellious slaves was because it wasn't just because it was so painful, it wasn't just because it was protracted, but because it was public. And so your sufferings, your humiliations were visible for everyone to see. You would be nailed or tied or suspended from a piece of wood. People would gather and watch as birds flocked around your head, perhaps pecked out your eyes, perhaps attacked your genitals, because you would not be wearing a loincloth. You would be naked. They would watch you as you heaved your body frantically up and down, gasping for air. And when in due course you died, they would watch you, a slab of meat, nailed to a piece of wood. And the horror of this was the point. The visibility of it was the point. The humiliation was the point. And so this is why, when Paul writes to communities of Roman citizens, in Rome itself, in Corinth, in Galatia, he's upfront about the fact that the Messiah he is preaching, this Christ, the fact that he suffered crucifixion, is likely to seem, well, he says it's a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles, foolishness to the Greeks and to the Romans. And that is exactly the point. This is, hold on, let me see if I can. Sorry, no, I've missed one of the photos out, I do apologize. The fact that crucifixion is so disgusting is something that causes Paul anxiety. And it seems to have caused Christians anxiety throughout the early centuries of the spread of Christ's message across the Roman world. People know that Christ was crucified. They know that in some way this must have been the point, that Christ must have chosen this most humiliating of deaths, that in a way the last shall be first and the first shall be last, that this is the lesson. But they are also aware that it is likely to seem very, very repellent to the people that they are preaching this message to. And this seems to have been an issue even after the Roman Empire becomes Christian, even after Constantine, who of course sees a vision of a cross. It's on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. Even once the Roman Empire has become Christian, there seems to be a reluctance on the part of Christian artists to show and to illustrate Christ actually on the cross. And it's not until 100 years after the conversion of Constantine that we start to get art that shows Christ on the cross. So this is one of the earliest. It's an ivory, and it shows scenes from the Passion. So on the left, you have Judas hanging, in despair. And on the right, you have Christ on the cross. Now, what you will immediately notice about this is that it does not correspond to what an actual crucifixion would have been like. Christ is looking very, very serene. In fact, he's looking very, very buff. He looks like a kind of, a footballer in Qatar soaking up the rays before the big match. And he's got his loincloth on. And the loincloth marks him out as an athlete. He is an athlete. He is someone who is going to conquer death in the great wrestling contest. And that sense of Christ as on the cross, as someone serene in his victory, is something that will pass into the Orthodox Church. So I went into one of the Orthodox churches here in Cluj today, and there was the image of Christ on the cross with a kind of very similar expression of serenity. And so that is very much part of the Orthodox tradition. You don't show the actual agonies of the crucifixion. But in the West, it was different. In the West, there came to be a growing focus on the agonies of Christ and his death. And so this is the first portrayal of Christ actually dead on the cross. It dates from around AD 1000, the first millennium. It's in a chapel in Cologne Cathedral in Germany. And over the course of the High Middle Ages, the centuries that followed the first millennium, more and more artists came to portray Christ as suffering the agonies that someone nailed to a cross would have suffered. It's vivid in the art, it's vivid in the liturgies, it's vivid in the prayers. Medieval Latin Christian.
I didn't realize that would open automatically on that window, so sorry. But yes, person, display name. I don't know if it's just not showing your display name for some reason, but I'm open to collab conversations. Just DM me.
Christendom is a world haunted by the sufferings of Christ on the cross, and these sufferings are counterpointed to the glory of the resurrection. And this becomes an incredibly dynamic part of the way that Christians in the Latin West come to understand who Christ is and what the story of the Passion is all about. And I think that Christians in the West become so habituated to the horrors of the crucifixion that they end up anesthetized to them. They become oblivious to them. Which is why I think today, if you go into a church and you look at a crucifix, the agonies that Christ suffered are not vivid, I think, in most people's hearts and minds. It may be different in Romania. I think it's certainly the case in my country and across much of the West, that we've become desensitized to what crucifixion meant. And I think that is why I found the experience of going to Sinjar so unsettling and so upsetting. And the paradox is that I would say that of all the modern writers, all the modern thinkers who have written about the crucifixion, the one who understood the strangeness that lies at the heart of Christianity, the fact that the crucifixion utterly upended things that the Romans and the Greeks had taken for granted, was not actually a Christian at all, but perhaps the most notorious of all modern atheists. And here he is, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche said of the crucifixion that to devise something which could even approach the seductive, intoxicating, anesthetizing, and corrupting power of that symbol of the Holy Cross, that horrific paradox of the crucified God, that mystery of an inconceivably ultimate, most extreme, cruel, and self-crucifixion undertaken for the salvation of mankind, how revolting that was. And it seemed revolting to Nietzsche because Nietzsche valued the martial, heroic qualities of the Greek and Roman world, that he understood the crucifixion destabilized. And Nietzsche could see more clearly, I think, than anyone else has done, that the way in which the crucifixion stands at the heart of Christian society has continued to shape its assumptions, its ideals, the things it takes for granted, even perhaps as institutional Christianity fades. So I would say, thinking about the communism that Romania suffered under, and many of you may find this a shocking thought, but I would say that even though it was hostile to Christianity, even though it destroyed and bulldozed churches, nevertheless, that communist regime would have been unthinkable without Christianity. The idea that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, fundamental to Marx's teachings. Where do they come from, if not from the Bible? The idea that...
Checkmate. Sorry. Yep, it's true.
There will be a day of reckoning, a day of judgment for the oppressors of the proletariat, a day of judgment. Again, unthinkable without the Bible. And even the way in which churches were smashed by people convinced that they were doing good, that they were doing right, that they were bringing people who had been living in darkness into light. That very process of iconoclasm, again, it's a very, very, very Christian assumption that you destroy buildings, you destroy idols, and you obtain enlightenment that way. So the paradox is, I think, that so deeply and profoundly does the cross lie at the heart of our civilization that even French revolutionaries, even Russian revolutionaries, even the regime that came to power here after the Second World War, unthinkable without Christianity, and perhaps to that degree Christian. But of course, Romania didn't just suffer from occupation, from communism. It also suffered from a very different form of totalitarianism. Nietzsche, when he prophesied the ultimate extinction of Christianity, he looked and he said, the destruction of Christianity, by which he meant not just institutional Christianity, but its beliefs and its values, will usher in a time of great convulsions, and deeds of terrible horror will be done. And he was right. I would say that if communism self-evidently bears the enduring stamp of Christianity, fascism, and Nazism perhaps especially, is the most radically anti-Christian ideology, and therefore the most radically revolutionary ideology that has emerged in Europe since the time of Constantine. And that's not just because it aimed at the eradication of institutional Christianity, although it absolutely did. It's also because it targeted for destruction perhaps two of the most fundamental values that Christianity has always embodied, that are kind of bound up in Paul's letters and ever since with the idea of Christ's sufferings on the cross, and aimed to destroy them in a way that continues to reverberate into the present. So the first is the idea that Paul extrapolates from the fact that Christ suffered on the cross for all of humanity, not just for Jews, not just for Greeks, but for everybody. That in Christ there is no Jew or Greek, as Paul famously wrote to the Galatians. This is something that the Nazis utterly repudiate. Of course they think that Jews and Greeks are different. In fact, Hitler blames the Jews for Paul. He blames the Jews for Christianity. He blames the Jews for corrupting and destroying the civilization of Greece and Rome, which perhaps is the most grotesque irony in history, that Hitler targeted the Jews for genocide because he blamed them for Christianity. But the Nazis also repudiated the idea that is manifest in the emblem of the cross, that it is better to suffer than to inflict suffering, that it is better to be the slave who is tortured by the master than the master who is torturing the slave, that in humiliation and death there is ultimate triumph and victory. The Nazis radically repudiated that. They viewed weakness with contempt. And if in many ways, fascism was a movement that looked to the future, Mussolini, obsessed by planes and cars and tanks and all kinds of stuff, Hitler was a far more modern figure, say, than Churchill was. So at the same time, they did very consciously, rather as Nietzsche had done, look back to the pre-Christian world for the ideal of what they felt humanity should be, or at least the section of humanity that Hitler wanted to see triumph.
As we titled this video, the post-Christian world would hate the pre-Christian one. That's where it leads.
Namely, conquest, power, strength, vigor, and that anything or anyone that opposed that had to be destroyed, which is why it wasn't only the Jews who were targeted for destruction, but those who were disabled, those who were weak, those who back in Sparta would have been flung down a cliff. And I think the shock of that for people in the West has given us a whole new post-Christian mythology. Because the reason that we in the West regard the Nazis as more evil than the communists, by and large, is because they practiced genocide for unacceptable reasons, for racist reasons, for reasons to do with the contempt for the weak. And that in turn means that in a society that is increasingly turning its back on the church, our horror at what the Nazis did give us a moral framework that remains Christian. So it's a moral framework in which Hitler is the devil. Nazis are demons. Auschwitz is hell. And if before the Second World War, people in the West would say, what should I do? I will do as Jesus did. Now when people say, what should I do? By and large, people say, I will do the opposite of what Hitler did. But I think the problem with this, for people in the West, is that merely calling people you don't like Nazis lacks the incredible complexity, the sophistication, the compassion, the moral profundity that Christianity for 2,000 years has embodied. And I think it's a kind of ersatz form of Christianity, just deriving our morals from a sense of what Hitler was and doing the opposite. I think in the long run is inadequate, which is why I'm so grateful for the invitation to come and talk to you today, and grateful for what you do, because I think that Christianity is the seedbed of everything that makes the West what it is.
It's wild. It's wild to hear him say that, because he's not a Christian. He's at this time, I believe, an agnostic. But it's nice to hear the intellectual honesty and appreciation for Christian belief. And just to touch on what he said previously about the goal is to not be Hitler. I think that's a huge problem with modern ethics and morality. It is largely, sorry if you hear the construction in the background in my neighborhood, but it's so largely defined by what we are not. We don't want to be fascists, we don't want to be this, we don't want to be that, but it just wanders into new potholes or other old potholes. In avoiding being this kind of evil, they end up being or promoting this kind of evil, and without a North Star, without an actual place to reference our morality, things tend to go askew. So another point to think about.
And without it, I kind of worry where we may end up. So thank you very much.
Okay, apparently I cut him off a sentence early because he was about to go into stuff. I'll go ahead and so that's that. I'll go ahead and I think there's Q&A time from here. We can play that for a bit as we round out the hour of this. But thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. If you find intellectual stuff like this interesting, feel free to subscribe. The idea with these lunch and learns is hey, have your lunch break at work, and just put this on and do whatever else too. But you can at least listen, maybe catch stuff here and there, and just grow in your worldview and understanding of things and wisdom and intellectual capacity and all that good stuff. Okay, so yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed this. Let's hear some questions.
Question. I think most of you have already submitted your questions, so we'll start reading them, and Tom Holland will try to address them as well. Okay, so the most voted question is this one. What do you think is the most amazing, powerful thing in Christianity?
The most amazing, powerful thing in Christianity? Well, it's what I've been talking about today. I think it's this idea that So in the 5th century, there was a bishop in Cappadocia in central Turkey who looked at the crucifixion and recognized that it was the death of a slave, and that the Son of God had chosen that fate, that this is what this was how he had chosen to die. And this Bishop Gregory of Nyssa, the city of Nyssa, said, well, that must mean that in some way slaves are closer to God than they are to emperors. And he further drew the conclusion, well, if that was the case, then surely slavery itself must be wrong. And no one really at the time had thought that. Christians were not in favor of slavery, but then they weren't in favor of poverty or hunger. Slavery was just seen as something that fallen humanity had to put up with. But Gregory of Nyssa says, actually, I think slavery is wrong. And I think that there, in the way that this bishop in the 5th century was looking at the crucifixion and the resurrection and coming to this very, very radical conclusion, a conclusion that again, for Christians in the 18th and 19th century would come to, which now has had such an effect that no one, apart perhaps from the Islamic State, would argue that slavery is morally justifiable. There you have the sense of what is, I think, astonishing about Christianity, that it is like a kind of great depth charge beneath assumptions and values that to us now seem unacceptable. And it's that the great central narrative of the Passion, of the fact that Christ goes to his death, suffers torture, rises from the dead, that seems to me to make Christianity utterly distinctive and utterly, utterly revolutionary.
Yes, exactly like I said at the beginning of this video, the roots of the abolition movement, the roots of the idea that slavery is not good, are found in Christendom, are found in Christian thought, in scriptures. And so that's I really appreciated that he made that point there. Gregory of Nyssa really started that conversation, and others built on it over millennia, over about 1,500 years, until in the West we finally began to get rid of it. But it's also worth noting that within hundreds of years of Gregory's life, slavery of other Christians even was outlawed in Christian societies, or slavery was outlawed even within nation states that were Christian. It was eventually kind of almost brought back into Europe by racist justifications that I would say combated things that had been the norm within Christendom for some time at that point.
Thank you. Another question here, which is kind of mirroring the first one. What is the most dangerous enemy for Christianity during the history and nowadays?
Well, I mean, I could say fascism, but I won't, because the fascists were defeated, and because the danger that they presented to Christianity was so self-evident that no one could really miss it. I would say that the danger to Christianity is contained within Christianity itself, by which I mean that I think that, in a strange way, atheism is a logical endpoint for a certain tradition within Christianity. And that tradition is, if you go back to the book of Isaiah, Isaiah condemns the gods of the Babylonians, or the Assyrians, or the Phoenicians, as merely stock and stone. And it's a running theme throughout the Old Testament that the spirits that inhabit the high places, or the groves of trees or springs, that these don't really exist, and even if they do exist, they are not to be worshipped. And that sense that actually the world is not as full of gods as people assume is one that the Christians inherit. And when Christian missionaries go out into the wilds of Germany or Scandinavia or Poland or whatever and preach the gospel, again and again, they will take axes to trees that have been worshipped by the pagans as somehow imbued with a sacral power. And that sense that idols are there to be toppled and that superstition has to be eradicated is something that runs throughout Christian history. And you can see it paradoxically in the Reformation, when the Protestant reformers turn this argument against the medieval church. and they start to topple idols and identify the Roman Church with superstition. And then what happens in the French Revolution is that the French revolutionaries do the same. They start, the reason that they're stabling their horses in churches and turning Notre Dame into a temple to reason is basically because they're doing what Christians have always done, which is to try and purge the world of superstition and to overthrow idols. And I think that you see that today, that in a way, atheists, particularly the most evangelical ones, are the heirs of that Christian tradition. Atheists like Richard Dawkins, the most famous atheist in Britain, are arguing that if you get rid of religion, you will become enlightened, that you will lead a better life, that you will be a morally better person. And that is a deeply, deeply Christian idea. So I think that is, in a way, that is the great danger. And I think furthermore, the problem with that is that, in a way, Christianity has won so totally that things that made Christianity distinctive in, say, the Roman period or the early medieval period, they're no longer distinctive. Christians have taught the world to care for the sick, to care for the weak, to care for the poor. The tasks such as, setting up hospitals or providing poor relief, which previously were run by the church, these have now been nationalized. These are now run by the state. And so just as you have people losing faith in God, so at the same time, people can take for granted the fruits of Christianity. They don't need to believe in God to inherit the fruits of Christianity. And that seems to me the gravest danger for Christians, that so much that made them distinctive is no longer distinctive, basically because they've won. And so those seem to me, part of the huge paradox of the Christian story is that in a way it's cancelled itself and made itself redundant for millions and millions of people.
Oh, thank you. Another question that will be a follow-up to this one is this one. As one who can easily look back, as a historian, obviously, do you think that we are heading to a climax? Does the events look like we are in a cycle, or rather we are heading towards the final point?
So do we face an apocalypse?
Perhaps.
Well,
just to, another one that would clarify the first one maybe, would be, how do you see the future of Christianity in Europe in the next 100 years? So we're looking towards the future now.
Okay, so to answer the second question first, I don't know is the answer. I mean, I think that there are, three possibilities. The first is that the liberal society in the West, that I think the liberal secular society in the West that I see is very much being the heir of Christendom, that it will maintain itself without Christian faith, that in a way Christianity was kind of like the rocket that's broken through the atmosphere and now it's kind of peeled off, and liberal Europe will just continue floating through space under its own velocity. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that the myth of the Second World War that I talked about and of Hitler will fade, and that as it does, and as Christian teachings start to fade, so it will be possible for people to re-enshrine the values of the ancient world, that the notion that power and glamour and swagger are to be valued and praised, and that weakness is to be despised, will re-emerge. And the third is that perhaps people will recognize what does seem to me absolutely the truth, discerned by Nietzsche, who argued that you can't really have Christian values without Christian belief, and that people in Europe will perhaps come to recognize that and return to a sense of the value of Christianity, which I think it's not a huge trend, but I think it is a trend that's happening at the moment. And it may well be that all three of those things will happen. But I don't know. I'm not a prophet, unlike Isaiah.
I totally agree with what he said there at that last bit. That's the direction that I personally feel things are moving. I feel that society has begun to see the natural ends of this path of just like total secularity, total absence of rootedness of moral belief and kind of philosophy of life and such. And in that, people are beginning to return to these Christian roots, to search again for that meaning. And some people, even for them, it's not Christianity, it's spirituality. I think there will be kind of a multi-part shift in which people begin to realize that this purely secular materialist worldview offers nothing except for like extremely high suicide rates and depression and meaninglessness and futility, and all of that. That hedonism likewise offers nothing in terms of true value in life. May shift into some vague spirituality or searching, and I think ultimately the pendulum swing will complete to some degree of a renewed interest, a renewed capturing of minds with the Christian message and with the message of Christ. And so that's something that that's how I perceive things going over the next 24, probably, like, I would say before 2050. That would be my expectation. So
Thank you. There is some optimism there.
We'll do one more.
Yes, I think so. I think that I think that you only really perhaps start to value something when you sense that you're losing it. And I think a lot of people, certainly in my country, and perhaps further in other countries, Western countries as well, there is a sense that something is being lost as Christianity diminishes, and a recognition that a lot of values and assumptions that people had assumed were just kind of hardwired into our brains, that they were just human nature, that actually they're quite culturally contingent and that they're dependent on Christianity. I think there is a kind of growing sense of that.
Thank you. I see, hearing the questions, there is some sense of fear towards the future. So another question in the same spirit. How much secularism affects Christianity? Is Europe still Christian?
Well, you see, as I hope I managed to suggest in the talk, I think the idea of there being something called the secular that is distinct from something called religion is completely Christian. And I think that one of the things that this means is that if you're Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or whatever living in the West, you have freedom of religion, you can practice your religion as you like, but you have to think of yourself as belonging to something called a religion. So the Jews in the 19th century, they could become citizens, say, of France or Prussia or whatever, but they had to stop thinking of themselves as a distinct people, as the people of Israel, as they had always done, and have to start thinking of themselves as belonging to a religion called Judaism. And no Jew had ever used the word Judaism. Judaism is a word coined by Christians in the 2nd century. But now you will hear Jews talk about themselves as belonging to a religion called Judaism, and that really reflects how Christianized they've been. And I think the same thing is happening with Muslims in the West, that Muslims are starting to think of themselves not as the Muslim people, but as belonging to a religion called Islam. So I think in that sense, the idea of the secular is a very, very Christian idea. But I do, of course, think that it's another of those aspects of Christianity that is damaging to the practice of Christian faith, because it implies that Christian faith and the practice of Christianity can be something that can be parked in a corner, that you have a kind of, a segment in a book or on a TV channel or whatever that is religion, that is Christianity, and that everything else has nothing to do with it. And I think that is a real problem for Christians.
It's interesting, this idea that secularism derives from Christianity. Would you expand on that?
Well, so this idea that Augustine first articulates, it's not Augustine really who first articulates, it's there in the Gospels. So when Jesus is asked, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And he famously answers, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God. He's identifying the existence of two dimensions. And I think that that's the essence of the Passion story, where he confronts the high priests of Jerusalem and he confronts Pontius Pilate, who is the servant of a temple cult in Rome. And he's saying, actually, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is separate from this kind of fusion of earthly power with an understanding of the supernatural. Jesus is abstracting himself from that. And I think that that's what Augustine is picking up, where he's saying, that there are these two dimensions. There's a dimension of the cyclum, the earthly flux, everything being born and dying, and then there's a dimension of religio, which joins us to the dimension of eternity. And over the course of the Middle Ages, in Latin Europe, although not in the Orthodox world, this becomes fundamental to the way that Christians in medieval Europe understand the world. And the Reformation really just kind of refines it, because certainly what happens in Protestant countries, and I'll use England as an example because it's the country I know best, obviously, religion by the 17th century has come to have a kind of double meaning. On the one hand, it's something that exists separate from the secular. So you can say, well, what religion, say, is England? It's Protestant. What religion is Spain? It's Catholic. But at the same time, religion for Protestants comes to mean, well, what do you believe? What is your religion? What is your personal relationship with God? It's something that is both. So in English, certainly, I don't know whether it's the same in Romanian, but in English, religion has this double meaning, that it's both personal and kind of to do with the broader kind of cultural context. But above all, it's something separate from the secular. And what has happened over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries is that whether in North America or in India or wherever, Protestants went out and they dominated vast swathes of the world. So when the British go to India, which people had always called Hindustan, the land of the Hindus, by which they meant Indians, and people would say, well, what is the religion of the Indians, of the Hindus? And it was a mad question, because people in India had no understanding of what a religion was. This was an entirely kind of Christian and specifically Protestant concept. But the British say, well, there are Hindus and their religion, and they have a religion, and they kind of tried to work it out, and they said, well, religion has to have holy books, and it has to have kind of holy buildings, and it has to have kind of certain rituals, and so they abstracted all this kind of stuff from the complexity of India, and they said, this must be the Hindu religion, this must be Hinduism. And there was no word in any Indian language that equated to Hinduism. It was an entire invention of the Protestant British. As was the idea of there being something called the secular. But because over the course of the British Raj, the Indian elites came to speak English and came to be educated in English understanding of the world, by the time the British leave India and India becomes independent, the idea that there is something called the secular and there is something called religion is so taken for granted by the Indian elites that they define India as a secular republic. And the idea that the duty of the secular republic is to preserve a kind of equal respect for all the various religions, so Hinduism and Islam and Christianity and Jainism and Buddhism and Sikhism. This is part of the founding assumption of India. But I think that what we've seen in India recently with the rise of Narendra Modi and this idea of Hindutva, which is basically the idea that India is not a secular country, that its history means that it's utterly saturated with Hindu ideas and principles, and you can't just kind of take bits out of this and say, well, this is a religion. The whole of India is Hindu. This is basically what Modi thinks. And that means, of course, then that there's no real place for Muslims or Christians, and so India is becoming a much less tolerant place for Muslims and Christians. But it's also becoming a lot less Western. And actually, what's happening in India at the moment is, it seems to me, a kind of final repudiation of that Protestant inheritance that the British had left. And I think you see a very similar process in Turkey, where, a couple of years ago, President Erdogan turned Hagia Sophia, the great Byzantine cathedral, back into a mosque. And of course, originally it had become a mosque with the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans. But the reason that Hagia Sophia was not a mosque, that it was a museum, was that with Ataturk, you had someone who came in and who was consciously trying to set up a secular state, not on the British model, but on the French model. The French model of laïcité, the idea that religion is something utterly separate from the state, is something that Ataturk buys into. And that's why Hagia Sophia, which had been a mosque, becomes a museum. It's a neutral space. It's the kind of perfect symbol of what Ataturk was trying to do. But I think that Erdogan, who is much more of a committed Muslim than Ataturk ever was, again, rather like Modi, he's recognizing that the idea of the secular is not something that is neutral. It's very Western, and I would argue unthinkable without Christianity. So Erdogan is basically, like Modi, trying to purge his country of the inheritance of the age when Christian powers were dominant. And I think that the more that Western power retreats, so the more it will become evident to, well, certainly to the rest of the world, but also to the West, that assumptions and attitudes and things they had taken for granted as simply being reflective of the way the world is, that this isn't actually the case at all, that actually these are very, very specific expressions of everything that makes the West the product of Christian history.
It's fantastic how this ripple effect that one verse can have throughout the history. It's just one verse.
Absolutely astonishing. And I think of, say, Paul's letters, which when I was a child, and I'd be sitting in that church that I showed you, and we'd have the reading from one of Paul's letters, I never understood a word of it. I mean, it meant nothing to me. And now I think these texts, these letters, are the most revolutionary letters ever written. They are like depth charges that were placed under the fabric of the Roman world and triggered. And to begin with, people in the Roman world couldn't feel them. And then there'd be a little ripple. And then there'd be another kind of ripple. And then the buildings would start to shake. And then by the end of the process, everything had been utterly altered. And we're still feeling those ripple effects now.
Yeah.
You know, the seismic effect is shaking out and still shaking the world to this day. They are astonishing letters. And yet those letters are just one part of this huge collection of texts that we call the Bible.
And we'll go ahead and end it there. We actually did talk last week in last week's Lunch and Learn, if you want to check that out. If any of you guys are still watching at this point, we talked about Paul on slavery and what his perspective appears to be, and how he set a depth charge under this institution of slavery, even though he didn't outright condemn it at any point. He said a few key things that would later contribute to the Christian understanding that slavery was not God's plan for humanity, and that it was not within his view of the world as it should be. So thank you guys for joining today. Every Wednesday around 12:30 Eastern time, we're going to do these Lunch and Learns. If a different time would be better for you guys, let me know in the comments. Just say like, hey, could we move it to this time maybe? I probably will start doing more than one a week also. So maybe we'll do one at 12:30 on Wednesdays and one on, I don't know, Tuesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern times, so you Pacific time folk can have a lunch and watch around noon your time. But anyways, thanks for joining, you guys. I hope you learned something from this. I hope you're able to just put it on the background and pull some nuggets